So EAP authentication is EAP is called extensible authentication protocol. The keyword to notice here is extensible. Okay. Now EAP is a layer 2 protocol that is very flexible, and many different flavors of EAP actually exist. That's why it's called extensible. Okay, it's a layer 2 protocol, and many flavors of EAP actually exist in the networking world. That is the reason why it's called extensible authentication protocol. Okay. Let's just take an example. As Cisco's lightweight extensible authentication protocol, it's also called LEAP. LEAP is Cisco proprietary. Okay, it is called lightweight extensible authentication. Let's say lightweight EAP, for example, right? I'll just take lightweight EAP. This is just one example of, but this is Cisco proprietary. Nobody else can use it. It has to be used with Cisco's infrastructure. Okay. Now, there are some open standard also. This was a proprietary one. There are some open standard type of EAP also. For example, PEEP, which is called protected EAP. This is probably the most widely deployed kind of EAP, right? I would say most deployed EAP, where you use username and the password. Okay. This is, yeah, by far the most deployed EAP, So some sort of EAP authentication actually provide for one-way authentication. Okay, the server validating the client's credentials, but there are some others also that provide two-way authentication. That's called mutual authentication. So both type of EAPs exist. One will do one-way authentication, and the others will do two-way authentication. And again, this is the most common. Okay, this is the most common. So by validating the basically in mutual authentication, the so in mutual authentication not only requires to authenticate that, I mean, what's really going to happen is, in mutual authentication, the client is also going to validate the authentication server here. Okay, so up till now we understand that the user sends username and the password to the server, and then the server will check the database and will say yes or no. Okay, now in mutual authentication, or two-way authentication, or also known as mutual authentication, the server, I mean the client, also validates the server. That also is very important. Okay, up till now, in one way, the server validates the client. Okay, the authentication server will validate the client. Here in mutual authentication, this will happen, but this also will happen. Okay, that is something which is very much going to happen in mutual authentication. Now, how does a client validate a server? By seeing the digital certificate of the server. In most scenarios, this is the most common way to check the digital certificate of the server. Now, this entire process of how this happens is in a lot of detail, which is beyond the scope of this particular course, because this is just the fundamentals of WLAN security. I might build another course specifically focused on security in depth, where I'm going to talk about how the tunnels are formed between the client and the AS, and how this entire thing is exchanged. But for now, just know that mutual authentication is the way to go. Happens in most of the EAPs, where the client also validates the server by seeing its digital certificate. Okay, now let me just quickly list down a few of the types of EAPs, so that you know what I'm talking about, what I mean by flexible. The first one, let's say EAP MD5. Okay, we anyway spoke about LEAP, we anyway spoke about PEEP, right? So PEEP is basically protected EAP. LEAP is lightweight. It's a Cisco proprietary EAP. Then we have something called EAP TLS, which uses certificates on both the side. Here we use username and the password, username and password. Here we use certificates on the client and the authentication server. This is probably the most difficult to implement because the certificates are also going to be stored somewhere. That's another extra cost to deploy. There is something called EAP TTLS. Okay, so in EAP TTLS, it's kind of like PEEP, but there are some minor changes in the internal functioning of EAP TTLS than PEEP. That is something which I'm not going to discuss here, but something very similar to PEEP TTLS is, right? And then we have EAP Fast also, right? So all these are flavors of EAP, and a lot more actually. Okay, and these are not just the ones. There are a lot more flavors of EAP also, which can be used in the networking world for client to authenticate, and that's the reason why it's called extensible, because it's very, very flexible, and we have a number of flavors of EAP that can be run on between the client and the the client and the authentication server.